The medical scanner hummed softly as it passed over Commander Vorth's damaged exoskeleton. 3 months had passed since the retreat from Earth, yet the scars still ached when the weather changed on Thyros Prime. His scaled hands shook slightly. As he reached for the water container, a tremor that had nothing to do with his physical injuries. Across the sterile white table, 2 Coalition intelligence analysts watched him with the patience of predators. They had been asking the same questions for weeks now, probing deeper each time, trying to understand how the 3rd Expeditionary Fleet had suffered such devastating losses against a primitive world. "Tell us about the initial bombardment again," said the first analyst, her voice flat and professional. "Your reports indicate complete success in the first phase." Vorth nodded slowly. The bombardment had gone exactly as planned. Orbital strikes had eliminated major military installations across the human homeworld. Their primitive nuclear weapons had been neutralized before they could launch. Major population centers had been reduced to rubble within hours. By all tactical measures, the invasion should have ended there. "The humans should have surrendered," Vorth said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Every other species we have encountered understands when they are defeated. When their cities burn and their armies are scattered, they accept terms. They negotiate. They submit." The second analyst leaned forward. "But the humans did not." "No." Vorth's claws scraped against the metal table. "They did something else entirely. Something we had never seen before in 300 years of coalition. Expansion. The bombardment had been textbook perfect. Kinetic strikes from orbit had eliminated government buildings, military bases, and communication networks. The humans had lost their ability to coordinate large-scale resistance within the first 6 hours. Their leaders were either dead or hiding in underground bunkers that posed no strategic threat. Yet when coalition forces began landing to secure key positions, they found not the broken remnants of a defeated civilization, but something far more dangerous. The humans had not collapsed into chaos as projected. Instead, they had fragmented into thousands of smaller groups, each continuing to fight with a determination that defied all logic. "Explain," the first analyst prompted. Vorth closed his eyes, remembering the first reports from ground commanders. They were everywhere. In buildings we thought were empty. In tunnels we had not detected. Moving through ruins that should have been impassable. They attacked supply convoys, sabotaged equipment, eliminated isolated patrols. The analysts exchanged glances. This pattern was becoming familiar as they debriefed survivors from other units. But they needed details, specific examples of how human resistance had evolved. "The children were the worst part," Vorth continued, his voice growing distant. "On civilized worlds, the young ones hide when war comes. They seek shelter with their elders. They wait for the fighting to end. Human children did the opposite." He remembered the first time he had seen it. A coalition patrol advancing through the ruins of what the humans called Detroit had been moving cautiously through a residential area, checking for survivors who might need medical attention. Standard procedure called for offering aid to civilian populations as a way of demonstrating coalition benevolence. The explosion had come from a building they had already cleared. A human child, no more than 10 years old, had waited until the patrol passed before detonating improvised explosives. The blast had killed 3 coalition soldiers and wounded 5 others. When they searched the building, they found only pieces of the child mixed with the rubble. "It made no tactical sense," Vorth explained. "The child could have achieved nothing with such an attack except her own death. Yet she chose to die, rather than let us pass unharmed." The second analyst made notes on his datapad. "Perhaps the child was coerced, forced by adult humans to carry out the attack." Vorth shook his head. "That is what we thought at first, but we captured video recordings from human communication networks. The child had made a recording before the attack, explaining her choice. She spoke of duty to her species, of pride in striking back against invaders. There was no fear in her voice, No sign of coercion, only determination. The pattern had repeated across the planet. Human children served as messengers, carrying information between resistance groups through sewers and maintenance tunnels too small for coalition forces to follow. They acted as spotters, using their small size and apparent innocence to gather intelligence on coalition positions. Some had even volunteered for suicide missions, viewing their own deaths as acceptable casualties if they could take coalition soldiers with them. Their entire species had militarized, Vorth said. Not just their armies, but every man, woman, and child on the planet. They had turned their entire civilization into a weapon pointed at us. What disturbed the coalition forces most was the speed of human adaptation. Within days of the first ground landings, human resistance groups had begun modifying their tactics based on observed coalition weaknesses. They learned that coalition soldiers relied heavily on electronic communication, so they developed crude jamming devices. They discovered that coalition armor was vulnerable to certain frequencies of sound, so they weaponized their musical instruments. Most unsettling was their approach to casualties. Coalition doctrine emphasized preserving lives and minimizing losses. Soldiers were trained to retreat when faced with overwhelming odds, to seek medical attention when injured, to prioritize their own survival so they could continue serving the greater good. Humans appeared to have no such inhibitions. They fought until they died or until their enemies died. Wounded humans continued fighting with injuries that would have incapacitated most coalition species. They refused medical attention from coalition forces, preferring to die rather than accept help from their enemies. They changed the rules, Vorth said finally. We came prepared to fight armies, to capture territory, to negotiate with governments. Instead, we found ourselves fighting an entire species that had decided death was preferable to surrender. The first analyst looked up from her notes. How did your forces respond to this unconventional resistance? Vorth was quiet for a long moment. We tried to adapt our tactics, but every change we made they countered within days. It was as if they were learning faster than we could teach ourselves. We began to suspect they were reading our communications, but their countermeasures appeared even when we used encrypted channels they could not possibly have broken. The truth was more disturbing. Humans were not intercepting coalition communications. They were simply observing coalition behavior and deducing tactical patterns from their actions. They possessed an intuitive understanding of warfare that allowed them to predict enemy responses and develop countermeasures in real time. By the end of the first month, Vorth concluded, we realized we were not fighting a war of conquest. We were fighting for our own survival against a species that had evolved, specifically to excel at killing. Rain mixed with ash fell steadily on the broken concrete as Vorth's transport landed in what the humans had called Detroit. The city stretched before them like a vast graveyard, its skeletal remains reaching toward a smoke-darkened sky. Buildings stood at impossible angles, their steel frames twisted by orbital bombardment into abstract sculptures of destruction. Vorth stepped onto human soil for the first time, his boots crunching on glass and debris. The air tasted of chemicals and burning metal. According to reconnaissance data, this urban area had housed nearly 700,000 humans before the bombardment. Thermal scans showed fewer than 50,000 remained, scattered throughout the ruins in small groups. Minimal resistance expected, his lieutenant reported, consulting the tactical display. Human military forces in this sector were eliminated during the initial strike. We should encounter only civilians seeking food and medical assistance. The battalion moved through the streets with practiced efficiency. Coalition doctrine called for establishing secure perimeters around strategic locations before beginning cleanup operations. They would set up aid stations, process surviving civilians, and begin the work of rebuilding under coalition administration. The first sign something was wrong came 20 minutes after landing. A sniper's shot echoed through the concrete canyons, and one of Vorth's soldiers dropped with a hole through his helmet. The shot had come from a building they had scanned and cleared just minutes earlier. "Return fire," Vorth ordered, but the sniper was already gone. Secondary scans showed no heat signatures in the building, no trace of the shooter. It was as if they had simply vanished. More shots followed over the next hour, single bullets fired from impossible positions. Then silence. Human snipers appeared to be moving through the ruins, using routes that Coalition scanners could not detect. They would fire once, kill or wound a Coalition soldier, then disappear completely. "How are they moving without us seeing them?" the lieutenant asked, studying the scanner readings with growing frustration. Vorth was beginning to understand. The humans were not moving through the ruins, they were moving under them. Centuries of urban development had created a vast network of tunnels, sewers, and underground passages that connected buildings throughout the city. The bombardment had destroyed the surface, but the underground remained intact. The real shock came when they tried to enter the first building. The door exploded inward as soon as a Coalition soldier touched the handle. The blast was crude but effective, killing 2 soldiers and injuring several others. Investigation revealed that human civilians had rigged every entrance with improvised explosives made from common household materials. "They are using their own homes as weapons," Vorth realized with growing horror. "Every building is a potential trap." Progress through the city slowed to a crawl as Coalition forces were forced to treat every structure as hostile. They developed procedures for clearing buildings safely, using heavy equipment to breach walls and advanced scanners to detect explosives. But the humans adapted faster than the Coalition could develop countermeasures. When Coalition forces began using scanners to detect booby traps, humans started using materials that would not register on the instruments. When they began breaching walls instead of using doors, humans rigged the walls with explosives too. Every tactical innovation was met with a new form of resistance within days. The psychological impact was devastating. Coalition soldiers had been trained to distinguish between military targets and civilian populations. But in human warfare, no such distinction existed. The elderly human who approached offering information about survivor locations might be genuine or might be wearing explosives under his clothes. The human child crying in the rubble might be injured and need help, or might be bait for an ambush. "They have weaponized their own weakness," Vorth reported to his commanders. "They use our desire to help civilians against us. Every act of mercy becomes a potential death trap." The worst incident came during the second week. Coalition forces had established an aid station in what appeared to be a secure area, offering medical treatment to injured humans. Dozens of civilians had gathered, many carrying wounded family members. The explosion, when it came, killed everyone present, both human and Coalition forces alike. Investigation revealed that one of the humans seeking medical attention had been carrying enough explosives to level a city block. The bomber had been a human female with genuine injuries, accompanied by what appeared to be her wounded child. Both had died in the blast along with everyone else. "She killed her own offspring to strike at us," Vorth told the analysts, his voice hollow with disbelief. "The child was not a prop or a disguise. It was her actual young one, and she chose to murder it along with herself to eliminate a handful of Coalition soldiers. This was warfare beyond anything in Coalition experience. Other species fought to protect their young, their families, their future. Humans appeared willing to sacrifice all of these things for the simple goal of killing their enemies. They treated their own lives, their own children, their own civilization as expendable resources in pursuit of victory. The pattern repeated throughout the city. Human resistance fighters would hide among genuine civilians, making it impossible for Coalition forces to distinguish between friend and enemy. When Coalition forces tried to evacuate civilian populations to safety, the evacuees would include resistance fighters who would attack the evacuation sites. When they tried to provide humanitarian aid, the aid workers would be targeted by humans who viewed any cooperation with Coalition forces as treason. They had turned their entire society into a weapon, Vorth explained. Every human was a potential soldier. Every building was a potential fortress. Every act of compassion was a potential vulnerability to be exploited. Most disturbing was the speed of human innovation. Using salvaged materials and basic tools, they were producing weapons that matched or exceeded coalition technology in specific applications. Human explosives were crude, but devastatingly effective in urban environments. Human communications. Equipment was primitive but nearly impossible to intercept or jam. Within weeks, human resistance groups had developed tactics that coalition military academies had never encountered. They would attack in small groups, strike rapidly, then disperse before coalition forces could respond. They avoided direct confrontation, preferring to wear down their enemies through 1,000 small cuts. We controlled the sky, the orbital space, and the major transportation routes, Vorth said. But the humans controlled everything else. Every shadow, every tunnel, every pile of rubble concealed potential enemies. We were fighting an entire planet that had decided to become our graveyard. The coalition had conquered dozens of worlds, but they had never faced anything like human warfare. Other species fought according to rules, traditions, and codes of honor that made their behavior predictable. Humans appeared to fight according to only one rule: win at any cost. By the time coalition forces finally abandoned Detroit, they had lost more soldiers to booby traps and suicide bombers than to actual military combat. The city had become a maze of death where every step forward cost blood, and where victory was measured not in territory gained, but in how many coalition soldiers made it through each day alive. We thought we were fighting for a city, Vorth concluded, but the humans had already decided the city was dead. They were fighting to make sure we died with it. The entrance to the subway tunnel yawned before them like the mouth of some ancient predator. Emergency lighting flickered weakly in the depths, casting dancing shadows that seemed to move with malevolent purpose. Vorth checked his weapon for the 100th time that day, knowing it would provide little comfort in the hell that waited below. 6 weeks into the ground campaign, coalition forces had learned to fear going underground. The humans had converted their urban transit systems into a 3-dimensional battlefield that extended dozens of levels beneath the surface. What had once been New York City's transportation network had become humanity's greatest weapon against the invaders. Motion sensors are useless down there, his communications officer reported, reviewing the data from previous incursions. Too much interference from abandoned machinery and structural damage. Thermal imaging picks up heat signatures everywhere, but most are false positives from electrical fires and steam pipes. Vorth studied the tunnel maps displayed on his tactical screen. The human underground was a maze of interconnected passages, maintenance shafts, and service tunnels that had been built and rebuilt over centuries. No single authority had overseen its construction, which meant no complete maps existed even in human databases. The passages twisted and branched in patterns that defied logic, creating a labyrinth where coalition forces could become lost within minutes of entering. "Squad leaders report ready," his lieutenant announced. "All units are equipped for close-quarters combat and have backup communication systems in case primary networks fail." The descent into darkness began with careful precision. Coalition soldiers moved in tight formation, weapons ready, sensors sweeping continuously for threats. The tunnels were wider than expected, designed to accommodate human vehicles that no longer ran. But width meant little when the enemy could attack from any direction. The first ambush came 20 meters from the entrance. Explosions echoed through the tunnels as charges hidden in the ceiling brought down tons of concrete and steel. The blast separated Vorth's unit into 3 groups, trapping them in different sections of the tunnel system with no way to reunite or retreat. "Contact front," came the voice over the communication system, followed immediately by the sharp crack of energy weapons firing in enclosed spaces. The sound was deafening in the confined space, echoing off tunnel walls until it became impossible to determine where shots were coming from. Human fighters emerged from maintenance shafts and service passages that coalition scanners had not detected. They moved through their urban warren like deadly shadows, appearing just long enough to fire a few shots before vanishing back into the darkness. Coalition soldiers found themselves shooting at ghosts, wasting ammunition on targets that were gone before the trigger could be pulled. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. Coalition forces had been trained for combat in open space, where enemies could be seen and engaged at distance. The tunnel system reduced engagement ranges to a few meters, turning every corner into a potential death trap and every shadow into a hiding place for human fighters. "They know every inch of this place," Forth reported to his remaining squad members as they took cover behind an abandoned subway car. "We are fighting them in their own home, and they have spent decades learning how to use it as a weapon. The bow." Humans had modified their underground environment with ruthless efficiency. Passages that coalition forces might use for advancement had been blocked with debris or rigged with explosives. Air circulation systems had been converted into gas delivery networks, allowing human fighters to deploy chemical weapons without endangering themselves. Electrical systems had been rewired to create shock traps and improvised weapons. Most disturbing was the human use of sound as a weapon. The tunnel acoustics amplified every noise, and human fighters had learned to use this to their advantage. They would create false audio signals to draw coalition forces into ambushes, or use high-frequency broadcasts that caused disorientation and panic among coalition species whose hearing was more sensitive than human ranges. "Movement in Shaft 7, a soldier reported, his voice tight with stress. "No visual confirmation, but acoustic sensors detect multiple contacts." Vorth aimed his weapon at the indicated passage, knowing the gesture was mostly futile. In the tunnels, by the time you could see a human fighter, it was usually too late. They had home field advantage in an arena they had been designing for their entire civilization. The attack came from 3 directions simultaneously. Human fighters dropped from overhead maintenance shafts while others emerged from hidden passages in the tunnel walls. They fired rapid bursts from primitive but effective weapons before disappearing back into the darkness. 2 coalition soldiers fell before the rest could even locate their attackers. "Fall back to Checkpoint Alpha," Vorth ordered. But the retreat route had already been compromised. Explosions behind them indicated that human fighters had collapsed the passages they had used to enter this section of the tunnel system. They were trapped in a maze with predators who knew every inch of terrain. Hours passed in a nightmare of running battles through the underground. Coalition forces would advance a few meters, encounter resistance, fight a brief engagement, then discover that their enemies had vanished while new threats appeared behind them. It was like fighting water, something that could not be grasped or pinned down long enough to defeat. The humans had weaponized their own urban infrastructure in ways that coalition military planners had never imagined. Subway cars had been converted into mobile fortifications that could be moved through the tunnels to create instant cover. Electrical systems provided power for improvised weapons and communication networks. Water and sewer lines had been modified to create traps and barriers. "We are not fighting soldiers," Forth realized as his unit took shelter in what had once been a subway station. "We are fighting the city itself. The humans have made their entire urban environment into a living weapon that attacks us from every direction." The worst part was the silence between battles. In the darkness of the tunnels, coalition forces could hear human fighters moving through passages just beyond their sensors, whispered communications in human languages that the universal translators could not parse completely. The sound of equipment being moved and positions being established. The humans were coordinating their attacks with a precision that suggested extensive preparation. They knew which passages coalition forces were likely to use, which positions offered the best defensive advantages, which routes could be used for retreat or reinforcement. They had turned their underground transportation network into a 3-dimensional chessboard where they controlled all the pieces. "Thermal bloom in Sector 12, his scanner operator reported. "Multiple signatures converging on our position from tunnels we have not explored." Vorth checked his ammunition supply and found it running dangerously low. Coalition soldiers carried Enough energy packs for sustained combat in open terrain, but the stop-and-start nature of tunnel fighting consumed ammunition at rates no quartermaster had anticipated. They were burning through supplies without accomplishing any meaningful objectives. The final engagement of that day came when coalition forces attempted to reach the surface through an emergency exit. The passage had been rigged with so many explosives that the detonation collapsed several city blocks above ground. The blast killed most of Vorth's remaining squad and left him buried under debris with several other survivors. When rescue teams finally dug them out 18 hours later, Vorth learned that similar disasters had occurred throughout the underground network. Coalition forces had lost entire companies to tunnel collapses, gas attacks, and ambushes in the darkness. The human underground had consumed coalition soldiers by the hundreds while inflicting minimal casualties on the defenders. How many human fighters do you estimate were in the tunnel system? The intelligence analyst asked. Vorth was quiet for a long moment. We never saw the same human twice. They would appear, attack, and vanish. We assumed we were fighting hundreds of resistance fighters, but after analyzing the evidence, we think there may have been fewer than 50 humans in the entire network. The revelation was staggering. Fewer than 50 human fighters had held off thousands of coalition soldiers for weeks, turning an underground transportation system into a meat grinder that consumed an entire invasion force. They had done it with improvised weapons, knowledge of local terrain, and a willingness to die that made retreat impossible and victory meaningless. They did not need to defeat us, Vorth concluded. They only needed to make us afraid to go underground. Once we feared the tunnels, they controlled the entire urban battlefield. The alarm shrieked through the forward command base as the first wave of human aircraft broke through the defensive perimeter. Vorth threw himself behind a concrete barrier as primitive but deadly projectiles rained down from the sky. What should have been impossible was happening before his eyes. Humans were launching a coordinated counteroffensive using captured coalition technology. 2 months into the invasion, everything had changed. The scattered resistance groups had somehow unified into a coherent fighting force that understood coalition weaknesses better than coalition commanders understood themselves. Human forces were no longer simply defending their ruined cities. They were actively hunting coalition positions with a level of tactical sophistication that should have taken years to develop. Incoming fighters, bearing 270, his radar operator called out. They are using our own energy signatures to mask their approach. Vorth watched in horror as human pilots flew captured coalition aircraft in ways that violated every safety protocol in existence. They pushed the engines beyond recommended limits, executed maneuvers that should have torn the airframes apart, and flew at altitudes that would kill most organic pilots through sheer gravitational stress. The first fighter screamed overhead, its hull glowing cherry red from atmospheric friction. Instead of pulling up to avoid ground fire, it continued its dive straight into the center of the coalition base. The explosion, when it struck the ammunition depot, lit up the Texas landscape for kilometers in every direction. "Suicide attack!" someone screamed over the communication network. The pilot deliberately crashed into our position. But it was not just one pilot. The entire flight of captured aircraft was diving toward coalition positions, their human pilots making no attempt to preserve their own lives. They flew like guided missiles with human brains, using their aircraft as delivery systems for maximum destruction rather than platforms for survival. Vorth had seen many forms of warfare during his military career, but this was something entirely new. Coalition pilots were trained to accomplish missions and return safely to base. The concept of deliberately sacrificing oneself to achieve tactical objectives was alien to most civilized species. They are not trying to win battles, he realized, with growing dread. They are trying to maximize our casualties regardless of their own losses. The pattern repeated across the entire front. Human ground forces would launch attacks that appeared suicidal by any rational military standard, but which achieved devastating results against coalition positions. They would charge through their own minefields to reach enemy lines. They would detonate explosive charges while still in contact with coalition forces, killing themselves along with their targets. Most disturbing was the systematic nature of these tactics. This was not desperate improvisation by untrained civilians. Human forces had developed an entire military doctrine based on the principle that their own lives were acceptable sacrifices if it meant inflicting greater casualties on their enemies. "Report from Sector 7, his communication officer announced. "Coalition medical facility has been overrun. Human forces killed all patients and medical staff before destroying the building." Vorth felt his blood turn cold. Attacking medical facilities violated every convention of civilized warfare. The Coalition had established field hospitals to treat both their own wounded and injured human civilians. According to all military protocols, medical facilities should be considered neutral territory, but humans did not recognize such distinctions. They viewed Coalition medical facilities as legitimate military targets because they allowed Coalition forces to return wounded soldiers to combat effectiveness. By destroying the hospitals and killing the patients, human forces eliminated both current and future threats to their resistance effort. "They are fighting total war," Vorth reported to his superiors. "No targets are off limits. No tactics are forbidden. They treat their entire civilization as expendable if it means driving us from their world." The escalation continued throughout the week. Human forces began using captured Coalition prisoners as psychological weapons, broadcasting recordings of torture sessions to demoralize remaining Coalition units. They targeted supply lines with a precision that suggested inside knowledge of Coalition logistics networks. They poisoned water supplies that Coalition forces might use, making basic survival a constant challenge. Most horrifying was their treatment of Coalition wounded. Rather than taking prisoners or offering medical assistance to injured enemies, human forces would execute wounded Coalition soldiers with clinical efficiency. They had studied Coalition physiology and developed methods of killing that caused maximum psychological impact on surviving troops. They filmed it, Vorth told the intelligence analysts, his voice barely audible. "Human fighters would record themselves killing our wounded and broadcast the videos to our communication networks. They wanted us to see what happened to Coalition, soldiers who fell into their hands. The psychological warfare was as devastating as the physical attacks. Coalition forces began to suffer from combat stress disorders that military psychologists had never encountered. Soldiers who had fought in dozens of campaigns across the galaxy were breaking down after weeks of fighting humans. The final straw came when human forces launched their first assault on Coalition orbital positions. Using modified versions of their own primitive rockets, they had created crude but effective weapons capable of reaching Coalition ships in low orbit. The missiles were not sophisticated by galactic standards, but they carried nuclear warheads salvaged from human military stockpiles. "Impossible," the naval commander had declared when the first reports arrived. "Human technology cannot achieve orbital capability from surface launch platforms." But the humans had not relied purely on their own technology. They had reverse-engineered Coalition equipment and integrated it with their existing weapons systems in ways that prioritized destructive capability over operational safety. The resulting hybrid weapons were unstable and dangerous, but they worked. 3 Coalition frigates were destroyed in the first orbital attack. Their crews killed when human missiles penetrated their defensive systems. The weapons should not have been capable of such precision, but human engineers had somehow modified them to home in on Coalition energy signatures. Investigation of the wreckage revealed the horrifying truth about human military innovation. They had not simply copied Coalition technology. They had improved it by removing all safety limitations and reliability features. Human weapons were designed to deliver maximum damage in single-use applications, regardless of the risk to their operators. "They turned our own engineering principles against us," Vorth explained. "Coalition weapons are built to last for decades with minimal maintenance. Human weapons are built to explode once as violently as possible, even if it kills the person firing them." The philosophical difference was staggering. Coalition technology represented thousands of years of engineering refinement focused on reliability, efficiency, and operator safety. Human modifications stripped away all of these considerations in favor of raw, destructive power. By the end of the second month, Coalition forces were losing equipment faster than reinforcements could replace it. Human forces had learned to capture Coalition weapons intact, modify them using human engineering principles, then use them against their original owners with devastating effectiveness. They weaponized our own compassion, Vorth concluded. Every mercy we showed, every attempt to minimize civilian casualties, every effort to conduct civilized warfare became a vulnerability they exploited. They forced us to choose between abandoning our principles or accepting defeat. The choice had been inevitable. Coalition forces were trained to fight other civilized species who shared basic concepts of honor, mercy, and proportional response. Against humans who recognized none of these limitations, such training became a fatal weakness. We could have matched their brutality, Vorth admitted. We could have bombarded their planet until nothing remained alive. But that would have made us like them, and our civilization has spent millennia evolving beyond such savagery. The humans had no such inhibitions. They embraced savagery as a tool of war, wielding it with the same precision other species applied to advanced technology. They had turned their entire planet into a weapon and themselves into ammunition, creating a form of warfare that civilized species could neither understand nor effectively counter. In the end, Vorth said, we realized we were not fighting for territory or resources. We were fighting for the survival of everything that makes civilization possible. And the humans had already chosen to abandon civilization in favor of victory. The evacuation ships hung like metal tiers against the darkness of space, their cargo holds filled with the broken remnants of what had once been the Coalition's most elite invasion force. Vorth stood at the observation deck of the command vessel, watching Earth shrink to a blue dot in the distance, knowing he would never see that cursed world again. 3 months of warfare had transformed the Coalition's greatest military triumph into their most devastating defeat. They had arrived with overwhelming technological superiority, complete orbital control, and the combined wisdom of 300 years of galactic conquest. They were retreating with less than 40% of their original force, leaving behind equipment worth more than some planets' entire gross domestic product. Final casualty reports are coming in, his aide announced quietly. Total Coalition losses stand at 62%. Human casualties are estimated at less than 15% of their remaining population. The numbers told a story that Coalition military historians would spend decades trying to understand. By every metric of technological advancement, tactical, training, and strategic planning, the Coalition should have achieved total victory within weeks. Instead, they had been systematically dismantled by what galactic civilization considered a primitive species barely capable of interstellar travel. Vorth reviewed the battle reports one final time, searching for some explanation that would make sense of the disaster. The humans had displayed capabilities that violated everything Coalition science understood about military development. They adapted to new situations faster than should have been biologically possible. They innovated weapons and tactics in real time during active combat. They fought with a coordination that suggested hive mind intelligence, yet maintained individual initiative that allowed for tactical flexibility. The orbital bombardment data is most disturbing, the fleet intelligence officer reported. Human resistance actually grew stronger after we destroyed their major population centers. Traditional military theory suggests that eliminating command structures should result in decreasing organized resistance over time. But human warfare did not follow traditional military theory. Instead of becoming weaker when their centralized command was destroyed, human forces became more dangerous. Small groups operated with complete independence, making tactical decisions based on local conditions without requiring orders from higher authority. The destruction of human cities had not eliminated their military capability. It had distributed that capability across millions of individual fighters, each capable of independent operation. Most disturbing was the speed of human technological advancement during the conflict. Coalition forces had arrived expecting to face primitive weapons based on chemical propulsion and nuclear fission. Within weeks, human fighters were using hybrid weapons that combined coalition energy technology with human engineering principles in ways that exceeded the performance of either system alone. They learned our technology faster than our own engineers could modify it, Vorth told the debriefing committee. Every weapon we brought to their world, they studied, copied, and improved within days. They understood our equipment better than we did because they were willing to use it in ways we had never considered. The Coalition had designed their weapons for longevity, reliability, and operator safety. Human modifications stripped away all safety features and pushed every component beyond recommended operating parameters. The resulting hybrid weapons were incredibly destructive, but had operational lifespans measured in minutes rather than years. It was a perfect metaphor for the philosophical difference between the two civilizations. Coalition forces fought to preserve their equipment, their personnel, and their civilization. Human forces fought to destroy everything, including themselves, in pursuit of victory. The psychological evaluations are complete, the fleet medical officer announced. 68% of surviving Coalition personnel are suffering from combat stress disorders. Many are reporting recurring nightmares about human tactical innovations. Recommended treatment includes memory modification therapy to remove traumatic experiences. Vorth declined the memory modification. He understood that forgetting would be a betrayal of the soldiers who had died learning the truth about humanity. Someone had to remember what they had discovered on that blue world, no matter how terrifying the knowledge might be. The humans had not simply defeated the Coalition militarily. They had revealed fundamental flaws in Coalition understanding of warfare, evolution, and civilization itself. For centuries, the Coalition had believed that intelligent species naturally evolved beyond primitive violence as they developed advanced technology and complex societies. Humanity proved that assumption catastrophically wrong. They had developed advanced technology while retaining and refining their capacity for violence. They had created complex societies specifically designed to support and enhance their military capabilities. Their entire civilization was a weapon system disguised as a peaceful culture. Analysis of captured human communications reveals the most disturbing aspect of their resistance, the intelligence officer reported. They were not fighting to preserve their civilization. They were fighting because they enjoyed the challenge. This revelation had shaken Coalition leadership to its core. Other species fought to defend their homes, their families, their way of life. Humans fought because warfare itself brought them satisfaction. They celebrated their victories with the same enthusiasm they mourned their defeats, but they never stopped fighting. Combat was not an interruption of their civilization. It was their civilization's highest form of expression. Vorth remembered intercepted human communications from the final weeks of the campaign. Human fighters discussing tactics with the excitement of artists exploring new creative possibilities. Human engineers treating captured Coalition equipment like puzzles to be solved rather than weapons to be feared. Human children playing games that simulated orbital bombardment scenarios, turning the destruction of their own cities into entertainment. They were having fun, Vorth said quietly. Even as their world burned around them, even as their people died by the millions, they approached warfare like it was the greatest game ever invented. They competed with each other to develop more creative ways of killing us. The Coalition had encountered aggressive species before, but never one that treated violence as a form of recreation. Human military innovation was driven not by necessity or survival instinct, but by genuine curiosity about how much destruction they could achieve with limited resources. They approached the problem of defeating a technologically superior enemy with the same enthusiasm other species might apply to artistic endeavors or scientific research. This explained their impossible rate of adaptation. Humans were not simply learning coalition technology out of desperation. They were studying it because they found the intellectual challenge stimulating. They reverse-engineered coalition weapons not just to use them, but to understand them well enough to improve upon them. They treated the entire invasion as an educational opportunity. The final orbital assault confirmed our worst fears about human capabilities, the fleet commander announced grimly. They achieved effective orbital strike capability using modified civilian infrastructure. No other species in coalition history has made such rapid technological leaps during active combat. Human forces had converted their space launch facilities into military installations capable of threatening coalition ships in orbit. Using a combination of captured coalition technology and their own engineering innovations, they had created surface-to-orbit weapons that could track and destroy military spacecraft. The weapons were crude by galactic standards, but they worked. More importantly, they demonstrated that humans could bridge technological gaps that should have taken decades of development in a matter of weeks. Given enough time, they would inevitably develop interstellar capability. When that happened, they would carry their unique approach to warfare to the rest of the galaxy. Recommendation from the Strategic Planning Committee, the intelligence officer continued. Immediate quarantine of the Sol system. No coalition vessels should approach within 50 light years of human space. All trade routes should be redirected to avoid any possibility of contact. Vorth nodded agreement with the recommendation, but he knew it would not be enough. Humans had already demonstrated their ability to reverse-engineer advanced technology from limited samples. Any future contact, no matter how carefully controlled, would provide them with new capabilities to study and improve. The quarantine will only delay the inevitable, he warned. Humans will develop faster than light travel on their own. When they do, they will spread throughout the galaxy, carrying warfare techniques that we cannot counter. The evacuation continued through the night cycle as coalition ships prepared for the jump to hyperspace. Each vessel carried detailed records of human tactical innovations, technological modifications, and psychological profiles. The data would be studied by coalition military academies for generations, though Vorth doubted it would help future commanders develop effective countermeasures. There is one final aspect of human warfare that must be understood, Vorth told the assembled officers. They did not fight us to defend their territory or preserve their way of life. They fought us to test themselves against the strongest opponents they could find. This was perhaps the most disturbing revelation of the entire campaign. Humans had not viewed the coalition invasion as a threat to be repelled, but as an opportunity to measure their capabilities against galactic civilization's finest military forces. They had treated the war as a form of competitive evaluation, using coalition soldiers as unwilling participants in their own advancement. They were grateful for the invasion, Vorth concluded. Human communications intercepted during the final weeks contained expressions of appreciation for the learning opportunity we had provided. They thanked us for bringing them new weapons to study, new tactics to analyze, and new opponents to defeat. The thought sent chills through the assembled officers. Most species feared contact with superior civilizations, worried about being conquered or absorbed. Humans welcomed such contact because it provided them with new challenges to overcome and new capabilities to acquire. Final intelligence assessment, the committee chairman announced. Humanity represents an existential threat to galactic civilization. They possess a form of evolutionary specialization that makes them uniquely adapted for warfare. They cannot be defeated through conventional military action, and they cannot be reasoned with through diplomatic channels. Vorth looked out at the stars, knowing that somewhere among them, humans were already working to develop the technology that would bring them into contact with other species. When that day came, every civilization in the galaxy would face the same choice the coalition had confronted: surrender their principles and fight like animals, or maintain their civilization and accept defeat. They are not evil, he said finally. They are not cruel or malicious. They are simply what their evolution made them, the perfect predators. And now they know that the galaxy contains prey worthy of their attention. The jump to hyperspace began as coalition ships fled from the Sol system, carrying with them the knowledge that humanity could not be contained forever. Somewhere behind them, on a world of blue oceans and green continents, the most dangerous species in the galaxy was preparing for its next great adventure. The war was over, but Vorth knew it was only the beginning. Humans had tasted galactic warfare and found it to their liking. They would spend the next few decades perfecting what they had learned, developing new capabilities, and preparing for the day when they would carry their unique gifts to the stars. When that day arrived, the galaxy would discover what coalition forces had learned in the ruins of Earth, that some species evolved beyond violence, while others evolved violence beyond recognition. Humanity belonged to the latter category, and they were very, very good at what they did.